Good afternoon. I am Alegre, Professor of Political Science at the University of New England, and this is Constitution Day 2017. This event is required by the federal government since 2004, and in most places, usually this is just a bureaucratic checking exercise. At UNE, we have been trying for the last 10 years to make it a really lively event where our faculty and our staff and our students engage in issues that are important to us in the society at large. And we try to relate it to the Constitution of the United States, which is an evolving document. When we try to figure out what will be the theme for this year, I had to consult with a few colleagues, and actually it wasn't my first choice. But my colleagues began to say, we cannot really overlook what happened in Virginia in August 12th, the event that really captured not only our society, but also was debated and commented on all over the globe about the meaning of the past and the present. So therefore, we decided to have a panel that tried to examine some aspect. Our purpose here is not to exhaust the case, but to examine some aspect of what happened in Virginia. And let me say that I think we need to remember that history is not just something distant from us. All societies debate, engage, and sometimes contest the past. And each generation and each a group of people in a given time, they will try to interpret the past as it's really related to contemporary issues. So sometimes it's about the past, but most likely it's about the present. The eminent historian Carl Baker said, the present chooses the past, which captures what goes on in our society now. Particularly important is the fact that monuments, historical monuments, is a specific example of this larger point. And in that sense, expression of power, these monuments, they really are expressions of power about who has the power to choose how history is remembered in public places. That's probably the larger significance and meaning of why people want to debate about a statue that has been there for a long time, because it matters. And in that sense, we want to see what's really the meaning of what happened there. How do we react to it? What's really formal about a statue, and how the ultra-right groups and the neo-Nazi and the KKK try to protest against the removal of General Lee in Charlottesville, Virginia. And what's really the matter with the whole idea of our history and heritage, and where President Donald Trump comment adds or inflates or really departure will be a departure from past presidents since maybe the middle of the 20th century. So these are the issues that are very, very important to explore and examine. And I asked three colleagues of mine to participate in this panel, and I'll give each one of them maybe 10 to 12 minutes. And after that, we'll open the forum for discussions and also for comments. The colleagues I asked to participate, and they are with me today, are Professor James Roche from the Department of Political Science. He teaches pre-law and law-related courses in our program. Associate Professor of History, Rob Alegre, who is our Latin American historian, and also very active in scholarship related to gender and class, and in Mexico, and also he is now exploring another topic about Chile. And finally, my colleague Jen Tuttle, professor of English in the Department of English at UNE, and she has been teaching and also writing about the question of gender and also race and the Afro-American experience at UNE. So each one of them, we will participate in our panel, and to control and manage the time well, I ask each one of them what they want to talk about. And I think in general, Professor Roche will talk and explore the First Amendment, free speech and hate speech and white supremacy, maybe aspect of that. And then Professor Alegre will examine the significance of Black Lives Matters movement and put it in a larger context. And finally, Professor Tuttle will examine the question of Jim Crow and how it's relevant today. So, this is going to be our panel. And before I give the chance to Professor Roche to talk about this, I want to make sure that to thank David for allowing us to have this panel today, and also the colleagues in the other campus, Portland campus. Also, I want to recognize our assistant Mary Johnson for her really hard work in arranging and facilitating this panel. And finally, I want to thank our students and faculty and some friends from the community whom I have been emailing and asking to join us, and it has been wonderful to see them here joining us in the larger debate. So Professor Roche will start and give us a short commentary about the First Amendment and its relevance to the issue of what happened in Virginia.
Okay, thank you, Ali. When Ali approached me about the event, and we were talking about it in context of the First Amendment, specifically free speech and the events at Charlottesville, immediately what comes to mind, which is the debate sort of nationwide, I think, both before and after Charlottesville, which is the idea of hate speech and should it be allowed and not allowed in that discussion. And I'll go through that briefly because I think that's an important discussion, at least to have an idea of what the law is. And I don't really like to say what the law is because, as I always tell my constitutional law class, the law is what 5 lifetime tenured unelected people have said it is, generally, at least in regards to constitutional law. And those individuals change. So in a sense, if we don't like a particular issue that's interpreted a certain way, that can always be changed, and we need to be alert and diligent about that. But what I wanted to bring up in addition to that is the other side specifically of free speech that I think oftentimes gets put on the back burner. And I think it's particularly important. I think Charlottesville in a lot of ways brought it to the forefront in the sense of whether there is a hate speech or not hate speech exception, and there isn't, and I'll talk about why and what the law is in regarding that. But regardless of that, whatever procedure comes up in regards to First Amendment, it really only works if all groups, all communities, have equal power when it comes to free speech. And of course, as everyone knows, right, at no point in American history has that been true, right? Has every community had equal and full right in regards to free speech. And so while the debate often focuses on one threat to free speech, which is governmental interference, right, and understandably so, that was sort of the precursor on why the framers drafted the First Amendment and its purpose, it rarely gets to the other side, which is how do we empower groups to be able to be in a position where they can take full advantage of that free speech right. And I think, as I said, Charlottesville, I think, reminds us of how far we have to go in that second aspect, one that often gets less attention. So let me just briefly back up real quickly in regards to what sort of the constitutional position is, specifically regarding governmental interference. Because this started, I think, the big debate on whether there was a hate speech exception to the First Amendment or not, really started probably about a year ago, coinciding with presidential politics, really sort of took on steam after Charlottesville. And the answer really, and it's not even particularly close or even a gray area, is that the United States has a very unique approach to free speech, and it's essentially you can say anything you want at all. If it is at all politically based, it does not matter how hateful or despicable or terrible it is. There will not be criminal charges, nor will there be liability civil charges, unless it's a factual statement that's defamatory. And there are slight exceptions, imminent calls for violence, but even those exceptions are incredibly narrowly drawn. And it's an interesting aspect. Let me put it, first of all, the reasoning for it, of course, is a number of things. Number one, the idea is that speech that is out in the open is far better than speech that is pushed to the corners of society, right? We don't want to hear about speech when it's bubbled up to this terrible spot. We want to hear about the beginning. We also don't want to give the sense of legitimizing speech. And when you sort of regulate and prohibit certain speech, in some people's eyes, it almost legitimizes what people are saying. And we don't want to do that. And the backbone of our system, right, our democratic system, it's based on popular sovereignty where everyone gets a say. And the idea is we can regulate ourselves. If that's the case, we've got to have trust in ourselves in the marketplace of ideas. We'll hear all the speech. We'll hear the terrible speech, the good speech, and we'll ignore the terrible speech and we'll adopt the good speech. Obviously, that's the hope. And the reason why I say it's not all that close is because it's really not a ideological issue. And it often comes up ideologically in certain cases. But what I mean by that is whether you're talking about, for those of you familiar with our Supreme Court, right, we have 9 justices, 4 very liberal justices, 4 very conservative justices, and then sort of a center-right justice, Justice Kennedy. And as a result, most of our very controversial constitutional cases are decided 5-4, except for free speech. Free speech is either 9-0 or 8-1 type cases. The St. Paul versus REV case, about 15, 20 years ago. A couple teenagers, white teenagers, put a burning cross in a African-American family's yard, right? Obviously, hate speech under just about anyone objectively reasonable standard. 8-1 decision because they were charged with a hate crime in the sense of there was a statute that prohibited hate speech in Michigan, and the court said, no, you cannot regulate hate speech. You want to charge them with trespassing or any type of other crime, you can do that, but you can't shut down speech. Snyder v. Phelps just a few years ago, a number of individuals outside a military funeral, and the most disparaging, distasteful, despicable comments you'll see on the posters. I won't go through them, but again, 8-1 decision. No, you can't prevent that type of speech. Okay, now there are certain time and place restrictions, but for the most part, you can't. And of course, that all stems. And even this is not just the judges. If you poll American people, you'll see that sort of sense. You'll also see it both with conservative. Cato Institute and various very conservative. You'll also see it in very liberal. The ACLU was the group that helped secure the permit in Charlottesville. They were the adamant group for Citizens United. And so this is not really an issue that necessarily cuts along ideological lines. So I think that's just an important aspect to keep in mind because oftentimes this discussion gets limited in a very superficial manner to should there be, shouldn't there be, is there not. There isn't. There's reasons why it's not. Doesn't mean it can ever change. But the idea that it's going to change anytime soon seems very, very unlikely. But that doesn't mean there isn't another side of this. And again, I think it's one that Charlottesville brought to light. And that is, of course, the other big threat to free speech. And the other big threat is not governmental interference, but it's a very small group of incredibly powerful, wealthy interests that can either suppress the speech of everybody else or drown out that speech. And in some sense, it comes up a little bit when the amount of interference is so overwhelming. Citizens United, I think, was probably the case that best brought this to the public attention, which was the idea that, for those of you who aren't familiar with Citizens United, there have been some attempts to put some limitation on the financial contributions of both people, in the Buckley case about 15 years before that, and then on corporations themselves in Citizens United. And in both ones, understandably so in the sense of looking at what the jurisprudence was of the Supreme Court, with briefs from the ACLU and conservative groups, the court says, no, we are not letting any governmental interference with free speech. Okay? Now, that's obviously problematic because, as the court knows, when that speech is allowed from very small specialized interests, it will, in effect, of course, cut down on free speech, massive amounts of free speech. The court is aware of this. I think the ACLU especially is struggling with this issue quite a bit. What those groups will say, and if you go to the ACLU website, if you go to a number of conservative websites, what you'll see consistently is sort of doubling down on the first one, which is, we get it, but if we just really don't let any governmental interference, hopefully both viewpoints or various viewpoints will arise. That, listen, there's going to be rich people who think a certain way and the rich people that think another way, and if they're the only people speaking, at least we'll get those types of competing views. I think it's become more problematic probably the last 7 or 8 years, even really especially since Citizens United, for 3 sort of major reasons. Am I doing okay on time? 2 minutes? Just quickly, we become far more interconnected. The voice box, the media in general has been more merged into very few groups. And of course, there's income inequality, which so as a result, we're hearing, more and more larger voices over the small. And so how do you deal with that? Number one, on a hopeful note, it looks like the Supreme Court's going to revisit Citizens United in the near future. There was a Montana Supreme Court case where they basically upheld a statute that clearly violates Citizens United. It says no corporate interests are allowed to speak at all in Montana, essentially. And the Supreme Court really should, either just not taken the case or said it's over. But they actually took the case, which suggests that they might be revisiting it. But the other thing I think is it should challenge all of us. When we hear about free speech, instead of boiling it down to this sort of superficial, is there hate speech, is there not, to look at it in a way of how can we empower people to be able to take full advantage of that right. And of course, that's going to spawn out into a whole bunch of other areas. When you talk about criminal justice reform, educational reform, all of those become essentially aspects under the First Amendment. And I think that's sort of a big lesson that come out with Charlottesville.
Thanks, James. This is a very interesting commentary about the legal constitutional aspect of free speech. And I think just 2 quick comments. The groups, the neo-Nazi and the KKK and other groups in Virginia also had guns, and also were really the threat of violence was there too. And I think that would be interesting to see where is really according to the American Constitution, free speech is guaranteed. And I think that's different from countries like Germany, for example, or other countries where hate speech is being prohibited. But also where we draw the line between, free speech, even for, groups that we find really racist and neo-Nazi and the threat of violence in society. And also the fact that the American concept of citizenship or articulation of citizenship really evolved. It used to be only white. So Irish and Italian and Jews and others were not really regarded. And then the abolitionist movement advocated the idea of multi-ethnic, multiracial citizenship that has been the case for almost post-Cold War. The statutes also came to existence in the 1920s. So I think this is really going to be a contentious issue, and I think Professor Roche gave us the constitutional articulation, the fact that still the American Constitution guarantees free speech, even in the most extreme cases. Next will be Professor Alegre, and he will address the Black Lives Movement. Go ahead.
I don't know how to. Hello, I'm Rob. Before I get started, I just want people to know that I teach a class here at UNE on slavery in the Americas, if you happen to be interested in this topic, which we also cover Latin America and the Caribbean. Just a little plug. So Black Lives Matters, if you don't know what it is, just very briefly, as a result of a number of killings of black people, primarily black men in the last several years, there emerged a movement to simply recognize that black people are much more likely to be victims of violence at the hands of the police and other citizens, and that violence goes unrecognized and that the injustice goes unpunished. That's simply what it is. It is, the word lives matters greatly because it is an acknowledgement that these people, that their lives have been disregarded. As a response, groups that were and many of the people who killed these black individuals are police officers. In response, some people who are allied with the police officers came up with the slogan "Blue Lives Matter," which, on the side of the Black Lives Matter, is pretty much it's basically, are there any blue human beings? No, there are no blue human beings, right? In short. So anyway, so that's what Black Lives Matter has been about. There was a boy in Florida that was killed by an individual, by a citizen, Trayvon Martin, his name was, the little boy who had a bag of Skittles. The citizen said he thought it was a gun and he was under violence, shot and killed him, and he was acquitted. Staten Island, New York, Eric Gardner was selling cigarettes outside of a candy store. He was wrestled down by the police, choked, and he was killed. Maryland, Baltimore. Freddie Gray, 2015, arrested for carrying a pocket knife. Gets taken in the ambulance, and he dies 7 days later. Michael Brown, 18, Ferguson, Missouri, died with his hands in the air. The cop said that he was going to attack him, and he was trying to take the gun out of the hand of the cop. Normally, in past, it would have been very easy to dismiss these people because we did not have the internet. We did not have video. But what we have now is video. And this has been a real change in the way these things have been addressed and the way the consciousness of Americans has been addressed. Further, if you go even deeper, it is more likely for an African-American man to go to jail in the United States than it is for him to go to college. The white population is 60 times more wealthy than the black population. So the inequalities run much deeper. I think the Black Lives Matter is to try to bring it in the simplest terms possible, that it is a life and that you should care for it as you would any other life. Now, as I prepared for this talk, obviously I'm a historian, and it's about the Constitution. And what became very clear, and if you know anything about American history, is that this denigration of black life, this dismissal of violence against black life, this persecution of black bodies is fundamental to American history and to American culture. Right? I just gave you the stats for just today that it's more like, right now in 2017, it's more likely for a black man to go to the jail than college. But if you were to look closer at the Constitution, there were 3 clauses in the Constitution which not only justify, but legitimize, and in fact codify the legality of denigrating black lives. Those 3 codes, of course, those 3 clauses each have to do with slavery. You may have heard of the 3/5 clause, where a slave was to be counted as 3/5 of a person for taxation purposes for the South. It was a compromise, right? The North wanted to count it as a full individual, but for taxation purposes, the South would have to pay more taxes in that case. So that's number 1. Number 2, you have the slave trade clause that legitimized the continuation of the African slave trade into the United States. And then you have the fugitive slave law that said if a slave from one state, and it really was not just slaves, it was coerced labor, indentured servants as well, but it was used primarily against slaves, that said if a slave from one state, a slave state, let's say like North Carolina, were to run away and go to a free state, let's say Maine could not house that slave. In other words, the law indicated that the slave had to be returned to North Carolina. What is remarkable, and the thing I think that is a theme throughout American history and in our own culture, is that in the Constitution, you have the silencing of this very inequitable fact. In other words, or to put it more plainly, the word slave or slavery is not indicated in any of those articles. So from the very beginning of our culture, of our society, we have this ambiguity, right? We have this uncomfortableness. We have this silencing of the denigration of black lives, where even at the very beginning, the elites who constructed the Constitution were not all in agreement about what to do with the African American population. But what they did all agree upon was to not mention slavery. Very important. As we go out throughout American history, the silencing of the black, basically black activism, or even just black cries about the injustices against them, continued. Up until 1950, there were over 4,000 cases of African Americans who were lynched, hung from trees, killed, executed by vigilantes, right? Those are only the ones on record. Last week in New Hampshire, if you did not see this, there was a little boy, 8 years old, who was called racist names. There was a rope put around his neck, and he was made to jump off of a table, right? And there are pictures of his neck scarred from this. Nowhere in the newspaper was that called a lynching. The silence of the Black Lives Matters movement as well, where it has been framed as a debate, as if our racist history did not exist. And so for me, those were all very much I think, issues that are related not just to the Constitution, to our own society, but this persistence of the denigration of Black lives. That's where I was going to go. That's all I got. I can talk a lot more, as you know. I teach a class on this, but I really want to open it up for Q&A if possible. So here's a.
Okay, thank you, Rob, and I know you're capable of talking more. But so I'm glad that you are in control and precise. Very, very much to the point as far as this important historical context. Lastly, Professor Tuttle will tell us about other aspects of this really debate that we have in society, and she will try to relate it to Jim Crow and other aspects that we didn't touch upon. Jen.
Thank you. So as an English professor, I pay attention to a variety of things. Certainly, I pay attention to events or ideas, but more prominently, how do those get represented? I pay attention to the impact of our language choices. I pay attention to the narratives that shape our perceptions. And so even on the topic of Black Lives Matter, it's so fascinating to me. And it's the way this the sort of representation around this really important group swirls in our culture. And so when I hear people say, oh, that group's so violent, I just want to go, no, Black Lives Matter is an organization that is protesting violence, especially extrajudicial violence against people of color. It's an organization that's calling attention to violence, right? But the spin, right, the representation is completely flipped. So these issues are really, really compelling and really important. I thought I would maybe build on the others and talk for a few seconds about the controversy over the Confederate statues. And I think that controversy speaks to how and why we publicly remember the Civil War and the past more generally. So, the competing protests at the University of Virginia and Charlottesville, those are discussed rightly as a conflict over the First Amendment right to free speech and assembly, right? And this is a crucially important discussion for us to be having, and Professor Roche definitely got us going in that direction, especially in sort of thinking about what's hate speech. The way we discuss this issue, though, not here, but I think I'm just sort of thinking about in general what I've been reading and seeing since mid-August when this event happened, might obscure important facts, might occupy public attention in one direction and thus distract us from or even displace other things that we also need to be talking about. So again, I'm interested in these issues of representation and how we talk about these things. What do we therefore not talk about? What kinds of choices do we make, and how reflective are we about representation, and more generally, what narrative dominates around the past? So I wanted to point out sort of 3 particular issues that I find troubling and I want to work through, and maybe just sort of put them out there for people to think about. First of all, the statues themselves, the Confederate statues. It was a statue of Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville that was of particular concern, right, during the events that sparked this panel. And of course, a lot of people say, well, the statues, they express Southern heritage. And so, my first question to that is, okay, whose heritage exactly are you talking about, right? Who counts and who doesn't in that question? During the Civil War era, more than half of the population of Charlottesville was enslaved. So is it those people's heritage that's being commemorated and remembered? Just a question. Second point, those who oppose people who have trouble with the statues say, oh, well, you want to erase history. And I find that incredibly ironic, too, because these statues are part of a larger phenomenon of what has been called plantation nostalgia. This had been on the rise before the Civil War, during the conflict over slavery, and it blossomed after the war. It's literature and songs and visual art and other cultural forms that portray the plantation South as this kind of idyllic, pastoral, pre-industrial place where everyone was happy. Everyone was happy in this narrative. And so in portraying a past that never was, right, ironically, this form of nostalgia also enacts a kind of amnesia about what in fact was actually happening and what the reality might have been for many, many people. So, historians talk about these issues a lot. They're in the business of looking at the past and thinking about, what stories do we tell about it. And so there's one historian, for example, David Blight, who looks at these kinds of narratives about the Old South, which include, films like Gone with the Wind. They include the Confederate flag, and they also include, these Confederate figure statues. And, he calls them a set of beliefs in search of a history, which I find really interesting. So even more to the point, really, the vast majority of the Confederate statues and monuments that have been at issue in public debate, especially lately, including the one of Lee, those were created and erected decades after the Civil War. They're products of the Jim Crow era, the segregation era, and of the Civil Rights era. So, you all can probably connect the dots and think through, possibly why then, right, would these be created and erected during those particular times? They're sort of, therefore, many people argue, much more widely associated with white supremacism, with reactionary attitudes toward assertions of equality on the part of people of color. And so, one of my friends, David Pham, actually pointed this out, so I'll quote him. He says, the Robert E. Lee statue in Charlottesville, that was erected in 1924. 59 years after the end of the Civil War. It's not Civil War history, it's 1920s history. Right? I mean, its subject is Civil War history, but why was that object of art created? Why was that representation created and erected, right, and when? And so he points out that the 1920s saw the rise of white supremacy and was the most popular era for the KKK, which sort of had a huge resurgence in the 19 teens. It saw the rise of xenophobia and religious intolerance toward Italian immigrants, Chinese immigrants, Catholics, Jews, Eastern Europeans. It was not a time in our, nation's history that we're particularly proud to necessarily look back on, at least in that sense. And so really, he sees it, and many people have argued this, that really the statue is really celebrating the resurgence of white supremacy in the early 20th century, turn of the century and beyond, rather than commemorating the Civil War at all. And you have a handout, many of you have a handout on your seats that is just a helpful graph. It's maybe one of many ways to think about this. It's put out by the Southern Poverty Law Center, but it helps to sort of help you visualize, it's a timeline of when were monuments to the Confederacy built and erected. And if you look at them, you can see there's a vast upspike at the turn of the century, which was precisely the time when lynching, which was terrorism, a white supremacist terrorism enacted on African American society and also other people of color, Jews, but mostly African Americans predominantly, and you see this again and again, right? That was the era when it's the low point, some people say, in sort of race relations post-Civil War. And that's precisely the era where you see a huge upspike in the creation of these. So again, just think about the timing, and that's important to consider. It's important to consider when were these representations created, right? For whom, as well as what they depict. And then the other two quick points I wanted to make were, so in addition to the fact that, if we're going to be talking about, sort of the debate over that Robert E. Lee statue, which again was what sparked the Unite the Right rally and the counter-protesters against those folks, then we need to think about, okay, but, right, when was that statue actually erected? What was it? What was its meaning when it was put up? And then also, of course, a couple other things. One, I really think that focusing on Southern monuments like the one at UVA, it's really important. It's important that we put on our critical thinking caps, our historical caps, right, and analyze this on all those questions that we've been talking about. And yet, I worry that doing that might also allow us to ignore the fact that white supremacy was and is not limited to the South. Nor was slavery. Okay, and then my final point is that, coming to a decision about how to handle Confederate monuments, leaving them in place with a new context, or moving them, or removing them, this is all, these things are being discussed all over the country right now. That's a powerful and valid gesture to open conversation about that, to have healthy debate about that. And yet, it's also important that I think that those discussions happen in tandem with, and not as a substitute for, dismantling and tackling and talking openly about the structural inequalities that remain in place to this day, that we have inherited from the Civil War era and before. And Professor Alegre alluded to those as well. I have more to say, but I think I'm going to leave it there so that we have a few minutes for questions.
Thanks, Jen. We have now, by way of summing up our panelists' point of view, the First Amendment, the free speech aspect of it, and Professor Alegre gave us the historical and the social background of Black matters lives, in the fact also there was violence in Virginia. There was a woman was killed there. Heather Heyer was killed there. And the same mindset was also, it goes beyond hate speech. Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing was also committed by, an American who belonged to similar groups there as well. So this is, I think, also something to keep in mind. And finally, Professor Tuttle gave us a commentary about how language matter, how we have to pay attention to language, and language is very, very important in understanding when these things became a factor, especially in the 1920s. The floor now is open for questions and also comments as well.
There are a couple of seats up here. Just see people stand up.
The Dean.
Thank you so much to the panel. I have a very broad question. So this book that you gave us, which I appreciate very much, begins with, this little book introduces you to the greatest legal document ever written, the United States Constitution. And last week, George Mitchell, former senator and storied diplomat, was on campus, and he said something similar. He said, with all our flaws and scars on our history, the United States remains, because of the Constitution, the best place to work all this stuff out in the country. And there's so much reverence for this document, and I just wonder if you agree that that's well placed. Should we revere this document as the best legal document ever written? Thank you.
Anybody want to take James, the lawyer? You want me to? Yeah, you're the lawyer, right?
Well, I guess I would say, certainly on one hand, it is indisputable the effect it's had worldwide. Right? And just look across how many countries have adopted a constitutional approach in search of specifically some of the aspects and results that were achieved through the American constitutional experience. Obviously, the statement is opinion-based, and so, of course, that's true. But so I think, and certainly on one side of it, I think it's impossible to sort of suggest it's not an incredibly relevant and in a lot of ways, of course, it's a compilation of ideas, the Roman Senate, the Greek, House, and all that. But in a lot of ways, the compilation itself is incredibly creative and ingenious. That being said, is it vague and ambiguous in a lot of areas? Of course it is. Has it led and will it lead probably in the future to incredible injustices? Of course it has. And so when you say reverence, I think there can be a reverence for the goal, the process, the vision. At the same time, there should never be a reverence for the actual language itself, because that, of course, can lead and has led to tremendous inequality and injustice in certain circumstances.
So the reverence. No, I disagree with that comment, not because it's wrong, but because it can't be substantiated, one, and because it follows us the old line of the American exceptionalism being the best and all those things. But really, what I really dislike about the reverence, that kind of holy kind of view towards the Constitution, is that it kind of denies the old founding fathers' beliefs, at least Thomas Jefferson, that the Constitution would need to be revised. Right, I think he had some weird mathematical calculation. Was it 19 years or something? There should be a constitutional convention. And Tom, so much about him I like, and he had one of my favorite Thomas Jefferson quotes, is that the earth belongs to the living. The Constitution is ours, and we can change it. We can, revise it. And treating it as a sacred document, I think, makes that, something that can't be done. I mean, that for me is the one thing.
I have to.
One more quick point.
Go ahead.
Just real quick. I just wanted to say I totally agree with you. And I think, too, again, thinking about the language, thinking about the narrative, it's about shaping this narrative of the Constitution. I think that your point clarifies how, in fact, even much more than Senator Mitchell's, bless him, right? That this is a document that is accessible to us to own and to possibly work with to improve the country that we inhabit, right? And the tensions that exist even in the preamble, are just staggering. So again, it's famous language, about securing the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. We have not done that yet. So.
And I would add just one comment to what my colleague said. I think it's incomplete statement. We repeat it often. The Constitution, because of the struggles of many abolitionists, social movement, non-property rights, women, Afro-Americans, other groups who were excluded, became more inclusive. But as a 18th century, it was a defective in some way. It was great in some way, but it was a defective and very much reflection of the powers. And I think the only way to salvage that statement is to say because it has been modified and made more inclusive and included many other members of the society, it became it received the respect that it deserves. But in the 18th century, some scholars say it was a frozen constitution, and because of those struggles, it became great now. And I think it's also, some people are saying that because we are more inclusive, more complex, more diverse today, this debate is really is an interesting one because it allows us to talk about it as James said, but at the same time, it's we maybe because we made so much progress, now there's a reaction, especially some advocates say that the election of the first Afro-American president in the United States also led to a reaction about certain segment of our society.
Can I just add one quick? And again, I agree with everything I think you're saying. I just would add, though, and maybe it's a legalistic version of it, but when you do look at the great successes, the Civil Rights Act, and the great successes in American history, they're always coined in phrases of trying to achieve. It's not arguing in spite of the Constitution. It's in compliance with the Constitution. It has not been achieved yet.
Well, I think most people who would say this is the best thing ever is because it has the mechanisms for its own evolution in it.
Yes. Okay, let's have questions. Patty.
I have a question for Professor Roche. Can you give us an example or so of hate speech prosecution in this country that has been successfully prosecuted? And then the second part is, how does the definition of hate speech in our country compare to Germany's working definition of hate speech?
And so we don't really, again, we have areas that are unprotected speech in the United States. Those typically are very narrow groups: pornography, obscenities, and imminent calls to violence. Not next week we're going to rush, the governmental building. It's right this second we're going to kill somebody type of things. So it's very narrow. There is really no, in the American sort of jurisprudence sense, a hate speech. What you said is despicable and hateful, and so we're not going to let you say it anymore. And so when you say, do I know of any cases that have been prosecuted on that basis? I don't. I'd be surprised what would exist unless it's coupled with an imminent call to violence or pornographic or obscenity type of things. But you're right, though. Germany, in Canada, actually, my constitutional comparative class, we look at the Canadian approach, which is similar to the German the approach in Germany, which is human dignity as a focal point of both constitutions, and they look at it as, and it's a very compelling way to look at the free speech, which is if it doesn't have any social value, then it would be therefore appropriate to somehow regulate that. Of course, the discussion when you get in the United States is who decides what social value, and that becomes the immediate fear, and so as a result, it hasn't taken hold. But that's the big difference between.
Let's take question from this side. So it will be egalitarian and to the spirit of the Constitution. Okay, come on, some of my students there too. So I want you to ask a question. Okay, there is a question there, yeah.
So I guess my question would be, these statues have been around for some of them 100 years, and they're just now getting talked about. would you say that's just because of the advancement in technology, or I don't know? I guess that's where the question lies.
Well, I would love to hear what everybody has to say about that. But I'll just say a couple quick things. My understanding is they have been talked about a lot. There's been dissension and controversy over them, always. It's not as if there was a time where everyone was like, oh yeah, we're all good with that. And then only now, right, is everybody going. And some context, of course, it's interesting, we've been talking about our current political climate where I think, there's been a sort of widespread recognition that white supremacy is increasingly being legitimized, right? And so these questions are really coming to the fore. But it's interesting about the Robert E. Lee statue. It was in, I think, 2013 when, this city councilor from Charlottesville, I find this fascinating. So this is before the election, right? Long before. Clearly it's not just our current moment that's driving this. It's a larger issue that already existed. But this city councilor is sitting there at the meeting and she asked a question. So think about this. She asked a question about the city's Confederate monuments. She reports, whether the city should discuss removing them. And she received death threats, right? That just sort of as a little not so fun fact, right, regarding this particular statue. But certainly I think you're right, and we probably all know this, that the increasing accessibility of social media and we are more and more connected like every week, right? So these debates become perhaps more public, or more people become aware of them. And so sometimes that does create the impression that this is the first time that this is blown up. But in fact, it's actually been going on for forever.
I'll say something. Nope. Hiya. So yes, all the things that Jennifer said, I think my direct response to the question is that I think the emergence of white supremacy that is linked to the embrace of the Confederacy. And so as a response, those who are fighting against racism have responded to that by saying, well, we need to get rid of these statues, obviously. As a teacher, one of the things that I'm surprised has not come out as much, or if at all, is treating these monuments, leaving them there, and treating them as teaching materials, putting next to the monument a plaque that explains everything that Jennifer just said, that they are basically they were constructed during Jim Crow, that they continue to serve a purpose for people who romanticize the Jim Crow past, et cetera, et cetera. Only because the one thing that I do find really hard to stomach is that the white supremacists have used the taking away of these statues as a way to present themselves as victims. And I find the same thing with the free speech stuff, where denying them free speech is is giving them a ground to present themselves as victims, as being denied something. Whereas I think it could be used really well as a teachable thing. That's different than what you asked, but that's just my little editorial.
One also related comment about your question. I think some people argue that the reason we have many cases of police brutality against Afro-Americans is because of technology, that the availability of the cell phones, the videos, and other things, that they are more exposed than before. So technology maybe was a factor in that sense, as well as the social media, which is now a global factor as well.
Can I just add one more quick thing? Really quick, just on that point. Just to say, this, maybe we all know this, but right? I mean, the whole point about the police brutality is it was always happening. It's not like there's been an increase. I mean, I'm not going to trace statistics since fall 2016, but I'm just saying, right? But it's not that there was actually any increase in it. African Americans have been saying this is happening, and no one has believed them. And so the dynamics are fascinating and changing now because it's on film, right?
Yes.
I just wanted to add that.
No, thank you. Let's take a question from this side. Alex.
Thanks so much, guys, for such a great talk. Just a couple of comments, really. So first of all, Jen, you're absolutely right. I'm a criminologist, and we've been studying this for quite a long time. And police brutality against African Americans is not new whatsoever. What's been very easy to do, though, is to create a narrative which essentially blames the African American for their own downfall. And we've even seen that even when the killing has been captured on tape, you've actually seen even a narrative that somehow undermines what you're actually seeing. You know, someone's being actually murdered right there on your screens, and yet there's a compelling narrative that somehow the dangerousness of black men acts as kind of grounds to kind of the extrajudicial killings. But one thing I really kind of found interesting about the Charlottesville march and the murder that happened is the way in which the equivalencies are often made between white supremacists on the one hand and on the other hand anti-racists, including Black Lives Matter, although they were both culpable of enacting awful violence against each other. And if both sides could just calm down, we'd all be kind of happy. And I find that very dispiriting because, of course, as a criminologist, you know, what we see is that we are far more in danger of being killed by a white supremacist terrorist. And yet, if I was to say to you all in this room, what comes to mind when you think of a terrorist, I am guessing it's not a white supremacist. You know, what comes to mind is you know, a person of color, a brown person. And so I think it makes us less appalled by the white supremacy. And just finally, I'm kind of putting a few ideas out here. I saw a research poll this week, which said that even though the majority of Americans really find obnoxious the white supremacists that we see marching in the streets kind of with their tiki torches, on the one hand. On the other hand, when they're asked in a different way about their ideas about race and about their ideas about Black Lives Matter, is that they believe in the same sort of things, right? The average American is not far from the beliefs or the ideologies, at least in a kind of a lesser form, than the white supremacists. And I think that when we focus on white supremacy, we often almost obfuscate what is mainstream, which is to demonize Black Lives Matter, to be up in arms about Colin Kaepernick taking a knee very peacefully as in protesting in sport. And I just find I sometimes find it's a little bit dangerous to think about racism as only the purview of white supremacists who are mowing down pedestrians, but it's that everyday racism that justifies the over-incarceration of black men, the extrajudicial killings of black men in the streets. So I said too much already, but I just wanted to put a few things out there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alex. Let's ask a very good soul in the Portland campus there if she would like to ask us a question or make a comment.
Adrienne McCauley here in Portland.
Hello, Adrienne.
So I really appreciate the historical and legal perspective on the current situation that we're finding ourselves in. And I think that it makes me wonder if you could draw any parallels to the health disparities that people of color in this country have compared to the white population, and how that might be impacting the current debate around universal health care, single payer system that is, on the forefront in the congressional discussions right now. Because it really seems to me all tied together when I listen to this historical and legal backdrop.
Okay, James, you want to respond to that since you wrote a master thesis on this, right?
Not exactly related to that, but that's actually an interesting point, and you can actually track for those of you who aren't familiar with Obamacare, I'm sure everyone has heard of it and somewhat familiar with it, but it really regulates in a lot of ways the private individual insurance market, not employer-based insurance. For the most part, it has some slight effect, but for the most part, it's individual-based. And so it's strictly tied to employment. And of course, there's a racial component to employment in the United States. So as a result, this plays out very much in racial terms. And if you track the actual approval rating of Obamacare, it really follows it. There was a great article, and I don't know if it was the New York Times or not, but basically saying that this uptick in Obamacare approval in the last 6 to 18 months has really coincided with the benefits starting to flow into middle America, predominantly white America. And so as a result, Obamacare for the first time is up into the mid 50% approval rating, and it had not been there for a long time, which of course has put tremendous pressure on the right to actually repeal this. So it's very much, I think, coincide with definitely a racial element with the both popularity of Obamacare and the debate of Obamacare in politics.
Thanks, James. Questions from the middle or from the left side? Oh, that's
in
Paul.
reference to the reverence for the Constitution, I think George Mitchell had in mind the current condition of the executive branch, also the legislative branch to some extent, and the checks and balances that are in place.
So he had a specific thing in
I
mind.
was there for his speech, and that's how I interpreted it.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Okay, David, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I had a question on the free speech debate, or at least not really technically a debate or whatever. Anyway, the fact that we have all the stuff that went down in Charlottesville, and then we have all the backlash that occurred, because we have both the government the government can't really prosecute free speech unless it's actual immediate violence. Well, we have the other aspect that happened to a lot of the protesters. At the moment that they left there, everybody, because of how much social media there and how much cover there, people knew who these people were. So I just think that there's another aspect to this debate of free speech that needs to be at least discussed, where you have whatever you have to say. It may clash against what everybody else has to say. And there's backlash to that. People lost their jobs, and other people even got kicked out of school. My personal belief is you can say what you want, but whatever it is, if it angers other people, that's your problem, but you should have accepted it. But it still needs to be discussed, because I see it everywhere I read.
Any of you would like to react to it, or just?
You bring up a great point. It's a timely one. It's the limitation of the Constitution in the sense the Constitution restricts governmental action. And so what you're talking about, for instance, right, I mean, when people take unpopular views and there immediately calls for them to be fired, right, or boycotted, or their companies, and that's private action. The Constitution doesn't reach that far. We have a very unique, our Constitution is vertical in nature. It restricts governmental action, unlike, for instance, Germany's Constitution, which is horizontal, which applies to private entities. And but some people argue, do you really have free speech if, in fact, whenever you walk around, if you say something out of step with social norms, you lose your livelihood and ability to make a living? And is that some area that should also be, incorporated somehow? I don't have an answer, but that's the question, and it's a lively debate.
Okay. Just to put it more concretely, if we were to say protect the speech, let's say something disgusting, bigotry, at the workplace, because I think that what you're talking about is at the workplace or at the university level, at the college. The danger, I think, I don't know if I would frame it as a danger, but the concern would be that then you can regulate in other ways private industry or private concerns. And so you would have pushback from the corporate community or from business in general. That's why I think we have this, what James is talking about, this vertical situation, right? Your rights are suspended once you walk into work. It's just as simple as that. As Noam Chomsky always talks about how at work it's a totalitarian state, where you can get fired for anything. They don't even have to tell you why you're getting fired.
I think the advantage of the American Constitution, to build on what James said earlier, is it guarantees free speech, even for groups that we find really distasteful and really hateful. And I think that's the larger argument behind free speech in the United States, despite the fact that many other democracies, constitutions, they will say, no, there are certain aspects that are hate speech and they are not tolerated. And the debate is not over. I think what we are talking about here, and in comparison with other places like Germany and Canada and other places, it's not over. And there are two sides to each one. The trouble and the challenge for us in the United States is when it becomes more than free speech, it becomes hate speech that really incites violence. Because in many places, including our universities, and they are the bastion of free exchange of ideas, more utopian than any other universities in the world around us. But also, even here, we have to follow a certain guideline about, discriminatory statement or discriminate in terms of sex, in terms of religion, in terms of cultures, and we want to make sure that everybody follows that. So this is really a larger issue, and I think we need to keep it in mind. The advantage in our Constitution in the United States is that really guarantees that every idea will be explored, and maybe, folks, out of really awful situation that happened and the killing of this young woman there, is maybe we have an opportunity to openly talk about these issues that are put, repressed, or they exist in certain circles of our society or certain region or certain communities. And I think that's maybe something positive, despite the fact that it was, the debate about how our president reacted to it and wavering back and forth about what to do about it, which is very, very new to us. That might, we could look at it in a different way. But maybe something good out of this really awful situation and the death of this young woman in Virginia. Okay, more questions and comments. Paul.
There's a section of the Constitution I don't understand.
Yeah.
It's Article 1, Section 8, subsection 8. And it should be interesting to academics in particular. And I wonder if it might be a good topic the next time around.
Maybe next year, if we are alive.
Someone's looking at it. I have no idea what it means.
Okay. Yes. Yes. I know, any other questions before we conclude? I know some of you have classes and so. Let me just thank all of you for coming and thank my colleagues here for participating in this really timely topic. And I want to conclude by sharing with you something the great Nelson Mandela, one of the great leaders of the 20th century liberation movement, who was in prison for over 27 years and also was not bitter, was not really carrying grudges. And he said that something resonates with me as I teach these cases at UNE, including a class I'm teaching today about social revolutions. And he said something like this. He said, people are not born racist. And they learn to become racist. And if they learn to become racist, they can learn to love and relate to others. And with that, I think I leave you, and I wish you a good day, and thank you for coming again.